So, this album that I'm about to talk about is very disturbing. It's not something that I would recommend to the faint of heart at all. It deals with very sensitive topics, and sonically, it's very out there. This is without question the most out there album that I've reviewed on this channel so far, so consider this your warning. Hi, everyone. It's Kable here, and it's time for a review of this Deprivationn album, Dreams of Death. This is, I believe, the debut full-length album from singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, and producer Deprivationn. Now, she has been making and releasing music for about a year-ish now, but back in June of this year, she dropped this album as well as an outtakes/demos compilation and also a mixtape that I'm not sure has anything to do with either release. Either way, this review will focus solely on Dreams of Death, as that is the main event release, at least as far as I can tell. Now, the only knowledge that I really had of this artist prior to me listening to this album back around when it first dropped was that she is the co-owner of One Starcade Records, a label that I've been keeping a loose eye on for a couple of months. Additionally, Sam LRC, an artist whose most recent work had been released via Starcade, makes an appearance on the penultimate track of this album, which I believe also played a huge role in me deciding to check out the album for myself. So with that little background out of the way, I think it's worth stressing up front that this album is not going to be for everyone, at all. It's intense, it's abrasive, and in a lot of ways not very welcoming. In fact, I think Deprivationn got some shit on Rate You Music for quote-unquote street teaming this album, which essentially boils down to her and her closest friends getting this in the top listening list that appears on the new music page on RIM. Me personally, I don't really get why people were so upset over this. Shouldn't we all be supportive of our fellow musicians and bands? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. However, it's not just the street teaming or whatever you want to call it, but it's also the genre tags. Essentially what happened is that Deprivationn said that her album is an experimental rock album, and a lot of people, including myself to some extent, did not really agree with this notion. I know that at least one person was trying to argue that Deprivationn was trying to make her album seem more accessible than it truly is, and I really don't think she had malice intentions when it came to this decision. I know I just said that I wouldn't necessarily call this an experimental rock album myself, but in a lot of ways it also kind of is. I guess to give an example of what I mean, remember when Injury Reserve dropped By the Time I Get to Phoenix back in 2021, and how that album pushed the boundaries of experimental hip-hop so far that it bordered on pure experimental? I'm getting kind of similar vibes with this album right here, Dreams of Death. I guess some of you might also be wondering why it is I'm reviewing this album now as opposed to back when it first dropped. Well, truth be told, I wasn't really planning on reviewing this album, at least on this channel, but as the year starts to close out on us, I began to reminisce back on the albums that I did manage to hear that dropped this year, and for some reason, Dreams of Death stuck in my mind. I guess it was also due for some deeper analysis from my end, hence why I decided to make this review. But with that spew out of the way, I think it's finally time to dive into the meat and potatoes of this album. It opens with this intro track of sorts called Ad Infinitum, and it opens with this booming distortion before starting to find its footing somewhat. You see, this opening track is very glitchy in sound. It's almost folktronica in a sense, well, with the glitchy vocals, or at least I think it's vocals, as well as just how off-kilter the guitars sound. I would say it sets the tone for the rest of the album, and in some ways I would be right, but in other ways, things are going to get more freaky with the next several tracks. So, that track ends, and track 2, If I Don't Change, I'm Gonna Die, starts. And it opens with this avant-folk passage that kind of sounds out of tune, and these weird vocals come in, and it feels like as this goes on, the guitar playing starts to become more and more aggressive until the track just caves into a glitched up nightmare with the guitarist trying to break back into the forefront of the mix, but ultimately failing. I can't really make out a word that she's saying within the song itself, or really any song on this album for that matter, given how disorienting the vocals are. But looking up the lyrics on Bandcamp, it reads like a welcome message of sorts, beckoning listeners into her own psyche, which is at an all-time low. I guess it's fitting that the song is called If I Don't Change, I'm Gonna Die, because it feels like the narrator is trying to make some pivotal changes within the song itself, hence all the chaos that surrounds it. But then we get to the next song, which is called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Now, I assume this title is in reference to the short story of the same name by Harlan Ellison. I haven't read the short story itself, but I have looked at the synopsis of it just to see if it has any parallels to the lyrics on this song, and let me just say, both are very horrific in terms of subject matter. While the short story foretells a scenario of never-ending torture and body horror, the song is its own form of torture and body horror, depicting someone asking some higher being to kill herself in the most grotesque way possible. Sonically, the song is very fucked up. I can kind of hear some circus music in the background, I think. And that's just buried behind the disorienting glitches and deep-pitched vocals. It's perhaps the most terrifying song on the album so far, if it isn't the most terrifying song on the album, period. Thankfully, the next song is a little bit more easygoing, or at least it starts out easygoing. Killer, lyrically at least, is set up like some sort of set on a movie, I think. I can't really tell what the heck is going on because lyrically this is one of the sparser songs on the album, but at the same time, Deprivationn is like screaming her guts out this time around, and while the actual lyrical content may not be as graphic, the performance is just as scary. Sonically, this is another avant-folk sounding track, kind of like towards the start of the album, but like I said, the performances, be it her singing or just the way she plays the guitar, it's just so horrific, but like I said, it's not as grotesque as the previous track. Lost in a Carnival of Souls is perhaps the most straightforward song so far on the album, which is ironic because the song is the longest one so far, at nearly 8 minutes. Like with I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, it sounds like fucked up circus music, especially in the back half of the track. However, the first half is more of that out-of-tune sounding guitar strumming, and while the song has no lyrical content, it's still pretty freaky, all things considered. Now, I've spilled a lot of ink regarding this album so far, and I haven't even touched the final 2 tracks yet, so let's just jump into that. Track 6, Come Taste the Reaper's Scythe. This is the one that features Sam LRC, as well as one Ugly Perfection. This song is massive, or at least it feels massive. Like, yeah, it is 14 minutes long, but I'd say this is the first time on this whole album where I wasn't completely terrified. Like, don't get me wrong, I still felt terrified listening to it, but not to the extent that I felt on previous cuts. That might just be because this song is the most straightforward of the bunch yet, but also maybe it's because I'm just so numb to this album's harshness that it doesn't freak me out like the previous songs did. I guess it also helps that the lyrical content is not as freaky as past songs. Like, yeah, the swallowing swords line at the beginning reads as pretty disturbing on its own, but as the lyrics progress, Deprivationn asks if she is just but a speck of blood on this huge planet, and that she is willing to find out if that is the case. Now, what exactly this means, I'm not really sure, but it is one of those moments that makes you wonder if she's going to be fine in the end. However, if that song didn't feel massive enough, then try the 20-minute long closing track, Nebula, which is perhaps the most pummeling in terms of sonics. With its blast beat drums provided by one Dorian, as well as its distorted noise, it almost reads as fucked up black metal music. Like, if I can draw a comparison point, there's this rather obscure atmospheric black metal and black noise project called the Torture des Ténèbres. I don't know how you pronounce that. And at least going off of memory, I'm kind of getting similar vibes here. Lyrically, it's also pretty massive, with Deprivationn asking the Nebula, I think, to end her life, blow her up into millions of star bits. It feels dramatic, and then the song stops. We get some silence, followed by what sounds like a field recording of sorts. I can't tell exactly what's going on. It almost sounds like someone erasing something off of a piece of paper while the cars drive by. It's like a moment of peace after the hellstorm that was this album. Maybe this whole album was just a horrific dream, and this outro is her reflecting on what had just happened. And yeah, that was the album. Yeah, this album shook me to the core. The more I dug deeper into it, and the more that I read into the lyrical themes, like I knew that this album was terrifying to some extent back when I first heard it back in June, and I knew that Deprivationn was having a very hard time when making this, but not to the extent that I do now. This album is really something that, even though I put over 1,000 words into the script, which is probably the most amount of words I've put into any review on here, I still feel like I can't really do justice this album. If I were to make one of those disturbing album icebergs like a lot of other people do, I would absolutely put this album out on there. I don't know where, but it would definitely be on that iceberg. But I don't think I answered this question yet, and I probably should do that before I wrap things up. Is Dreams of Death by Deprivationn good? Personally, I would say yes. I wouldn't go so far as to call it my album of the year because it's not the type of album that I would want to listen to frequently, but it's probably the album from this year that left the most impact on me. It's not going to be an album that's for everyone, and I'm not really sure if I could recommend it to people because it really is just a brutal depiction of someone at their lowest, and I know that not everyone wants to sit through something like that, especially when the music is just as abrasive as the lyrical content. Yeah, I don't know. I think I think I need to leave this review at that because I I just don't know what else to say anymore. I hope you have a good day.